You're in for some reality check. The debate on climate change is one of the most defining features of our modern day societies, and as the climate alarmists keep advocating for more radical steps than we are currently taking, people are beginning to wake up and fight back. Jordan Peterson and Bjørn Lomborg discuss the effects of this issue on our lives and demonstrate why we shouldn't let such alarmist hysteria take over our lives. But before I delve deeper into it, just watch this.
The degrowth model is predicated on the idea that, well, let's lay out the ideas, that really there are too many people on the planet, and the people who are there now, especially the rich ones, are consuming far too many resources per capita. And so the only way forward to a sustainable planet is through degrowth. Okay, so let's take that apart. First of all, who's going to impose that degrowth? Like, can you imagine the totalitarian state that would have to be built in order for every single one of your purchases to be monitored, which is really what the plan is in some real sense? I mean, that's just a terrible, nightmarish vision of petty tyranny everywhere, where every single move you make is analyzed in terms of its overall planetary consequence, and only calculated by people who do not have your best interests in mind, by the way. But worse than that is that there isn't any evidence whatsoever that if you use this strategy of degrowth and you make people poor, that you're going to get anything approximating the beneficial effect that you propose. I mean, let's look at how this is already playing out. So we have this reflexively anti-capitalist notion in the West often that lurks at the bottom of some of the metaphorical realms that we've been discussing, that there's something suspect about wealth. But the thing about wealth is that if you use it ethically, it's life more abundant. If you use that ethically, then part of the utility in gathering wealth is that hypothetically you can go, well, first of all, make more wealth with it, but you can do good things with it. And so it isn't like Scrooge McDuck luxury in the money bin that we're talking about here. It's the opportunity to make things better for people. Now, the other thing we wrote about in that op-ed, you just talked about the education front. Maybe we can close with this next proposition. And by the way, for those of you listening and watching, this is just one of many, although Bjørn's done a very good job of trying to rank order these in terms of, well, let's do the cheap and easy things first. We might as well hit the ball out of the park, at least in the places we can.
Before I go on with the video, this is a good time to subscribe if you're interested in the discussion. To get a better understanding on what the concept of degrowth is, it's important to look at what this theory argues. It questions the idea of economic growth as the key for human progress, asserting that unlimited growth is not only environmentally unsustainable, but also socially unjust. Degrowth theorists point that the current economic system leads to increased consumption of natural resources, destruction of the environment, and growth of social inequities. I think that a fancy way of saying they're anti-capitalism and pro-socialism. All degrowth models are built on the idea that governments need to reduce the emphasis on GDP as the primary measure of improving human well-being and instead focus on sustainable, equitable, and regenerative systems. It would essentially mean a decline in living standards in the West and keep developing countries poor. The key point this theory is missing is that growth doesn't mean more resources are used in increased production. It means using resources in more efficient ways to produce more goods and maximize profits. For instance, if you check the United States GDP for the past 50 years, it has been constantly growing, but it is using less carbon compared to the past decades. If we imagine a scenario where we do what the theory suggests, starting with production, we would somehow as a society have to agree that certain industries and products are going to be illegal. Not just fossil fuels, but also meat and dairy, cars and planes. They would basically create a recession. People cannot drive to work, buy food, and legislators cannot fly to DC. Life would come to a standstill. This model also requires a centrally planned economy, which simply hasn't worked in the history of our civilization. You don't have to look far back in history to see the results of such economies. Modern-day Venezuela, for example, although it has the largest oil reserves in the world and 7th largest gas reserves as well, the country has been experiencing a severe economic meltdown for the past decade. That's the thing with theories like degrowth. They attempt to radically alter the way that we live using the threat of a looming environmental catastrophe to generate the political will to blow the system up and create a new reality.
We've gone from a world over the last 100 years. In 1928, we estimate about 2/3 of the whole world was deficient in food. So basically we were starving. 2/3 of us were starving. Today, that number is down below 10%, but that's still very high. That's still about 800 million people. So there's still a big problem. Again, we can have diminishing problems to still want to do something about it. How do you fix this? Well, in the long run, you actually need to get much better productivity in agriculture, and we have some other solutions for that. But it turns out just giving out lots and lots of food is not only very expensive because you actually have to distribute it, it also typically destroys local agriculture. If you give out all the food, then they don't have any incentive to produce it next year, and you actually end up very easily make more problems. The point here is not that this is what you should be doing, but it's one of the many things that you could choose and say, look, I want to do something that actually matters and that has huge impact, rather than just go with, oh my God, the world is terrible, and then I'm just going to give up, or I'm just going to go for these cheap, easy virtue signaling. This is about, there are a lot of technologies, there are a lot of innovations where we can actually make a lot of good at very low cost, very effectively.
So we started by talking about the underlying metaphysic or even theology of the current worldview, and laid out the proposition that we tend to insist that young people see the planet as a fragile virgin, and culture as a rapacious predator, and the individual as a parasitic predator, and that has its echoes in the a priori religious landscape, but that it's a very one-sided story. And the corrective to that story is, well, nature can be pretty damn hard on us and needs to be tamed and controlled in a manner that's sustainable. We should be extremely grateful for what our culture has provided us with, not least the ability to look at nature as though it was benevolent. And we shouldn't be so damn hard on individual people, because for all their flaws, they can be Norman Borlaug, for example, or the people who worked along with them, who are genuinely contributing not only to a much more productive and generous economy, but also doing that in a manner that's beneficial on the environmental front. And so we need to balance our viewpoint, and we need to stop terrifying young people into apocalyptic nightmares by insisting that the world is going to collapse and that all the power should be given to, like, terrified, centralized tyrants.
That's the truth about how our governments and the mainstream media handles things. We're constantly being fed information that's supposed to paralyze us from the fear of the unknown. That was the case with the ozone hole and acid rains in the past few decades, and the modern one is climate change. It gives media consumers the sense that they are mere observers and their actions matter little in the face of a massive global catastrophe. For instance, if you go to your doctor with a sickness, it's bad, but there's still a good chance for you to turn things around. How would you feel if your doctor just shook their head or got panicky and said, "Oh wow, this is terrible! Do you realize you could die?" You ask them, "Well, what should I do?" And they say, "I don't really know, but you better do it fast because this does not look good." That's the same approach environmental alarmists are taking, a doomsday approach that promotes fear over inspiring constructive action. Adopting such an approach to climate change, characterized by extreme pessimism and dire predictions of impending catastrophe, is not only counterproductive but also detrimental to meaningful action and progress in addressing environmental challenges. This defeatist mindset hinders collective efforts to mitigate the problems of our modern world and adapt to its impacts. I think instead of focusing on worst-case scenarios, it is more productive to emphasize the potential for positive change and the importance of collective action in addressing such issues. That's why we're seeing more and more people express their criticism against the climate alarmists. Take this recent Guardian article, for example. The author notes, and I quote, "My perspective flipped quickly after studying the data, not newspaper headlines. I didn't focus on where we are today, but on the pace that things have moved at in the last few years and what this means for the future. Climate alarmists are constantly overlooking the progress we're making and calling for much more extreme measures, such as degrowth, since anything goes nowadays. I think as a society we should keep highlighting success stories and showcasing innovative solutions to our modern world problems so we can inspire optimism and build a sense of agency among individuals and communities."